Hey, whole Bible readers, it is week 36. That means we are closing in on the end of the third quarter. Coming, if it's 4 laps around the track, we're coming around to the end of the third one. And another landmark, we're going to be finishing the Gospel of Matthew this week. So, some things to notice in Matthew as we wrap it up. Notice how when Jesus gets to Jerusalem and he's asked about his authority, at first he says, well, I won't answer if you don't answer my question, which is kind of a Jesus thing to do when he's confronted by opponents. But then he does answer with a parable in which he casts himself as the son of the vineyard owner who's killed by the tenants in the vineyard who want to keep the vineyard for themselves. He's really explaining his death as the work of his opponents in the priestly establishment in Jerusalem, these people who are confronting him right there at that time, and describing it as insurrection against God by murdering God's son. Very important for us to see how Jesus is making that claim. As Jesus denounces the religious leaders a little bit later in Matthew, notice how he calls out their hypocrisy in various ways, but especially because they reject him, the one who is sent in God's name, as this is kind of the culmination of their other hypocrisy, claiming to follow God when in fact they don't do what God says. In Matthew 24 and 25, we have a passage that some people have interpreted as a prediction of a future tribulation. But as you read that, I want you to notice how Jesus is describing, first of all, the destruction of Jerusalem, which he's warning his disciples about when he says, not one stone of the temple will be left on another. Well, that's a sign of God's judgment against the priestly establishment that is attacking him. But it's also a warning to the disciples that they need to leave Jerusalem when that happens. Well, looking beyond that, Jesus says, I will indeed return as king. And remember, the disciples don't even know that he's leaving yet. At least they don't understand that, right? They don't understand his death and resurrection, let alone his ascension. But he's saying, I am going to rule fully, soon enough for you, but at a time no one knows about. Well, how's it going to be soon enough? I think because Jesus raises the dead. But more about that a little bit later in the New Testament. So, things not to be confused with Jesus coming. Anything that's going on in the world, persecution, all of that stuff, Jesus says that's just garden variety stuff. You don't associate that with God's kingdom. It's going to happen in your experience. When Jesus goes to his death, he offers no resistance. And the 22nd Psalm is like the underlying music in the telling of Jesus' crucifixion. So you might go back and read that and realize Jesus is dying as the greatest of the righteous people of God who suffer. But also, we've got Isaiah 53 going in the background. Jesus dies as God's suffering servant for the sake of his sinful people. At the resurrection, it's the women who discover that Jesus is alive and to whom the message is first given, who deliver the message first. You notice, interestingly, as Jesus appears to his followers, there are some who doubt. But notice how he gives the Great Commission, as we call it. This is going to all nations, fulfilling the promise to Abraham that we began the Gospel of Matthew with. But also he says, I am with you always. Matthew began with Isaiah 7:14, the promise of Emmanuel, God with us. Now Jesus is making that promise. Okay, then we're going to go into Mark. Now, nearly every story that is in Mark is also found in Matthew or in Luke. So eventually we're going to see this is kind of repetitive, but it's Mark's arrangement and emphasis that's going to be important here. He puts emphasis on Jesus' power, on his authority over everything, and on the disciples' failure, on their persistent inability to understand who he is or to act on that. So as you're reading Mark's gospel, really kind of take in that very interesting message. And we'll have more to say about that as we get to the end of Mark as to how all of that is going to wrap up. All right, this is some very challenging and very rewarding reading. It's going to move hard and fast. So I hope you enjoy this week's reading in the Full Bible Reader.